ISO Productions presents another instructional video tutorial from ISO FileMaker Magazine, the professional's resource for FileMaker know-how.
Well, hello and welcome back to yet another tutorial video learning about FileMaker. My name is Matt Petrowski, bringing you these FileMaker tutorials over at FileMakerMagazine.com. In this particular tutorial, we are taking a look at the notion of FileMaker deployment models, making solutions as efficient as possible. Now, before I head into the rest of the video, I want to point out that I took the approach that this is a little bit in terms of what I'm providing information about addressing the mobile dilemma. And that is the fact that a mobile device can have a spotty connection, that connection can break, it can go away, and basically our goal is to keep a user functional still using FileMaker. Now, everything I explained can obviously still be used on the desktop, but the implementation of this, while it takes a little bit of technical finesse, the concepts that I explain here are perfectly doable in terms of deploying a FileMaker solution. So let's head into the rest of this video. All right, so let's take a look at what I'm talking about. What we have in our current setup of FileMaker Pro, what we have on screen, is a very standard, typical setup. We have a copy of FileMaker Server. Some people use FileMaker Pro, and this is our server over here. Now, our server allows us to obviously host the FileMaker solution. And our client typically connects to server, authenticates and asks for that information, and then the server passes the file back to the client. Now, the file itself includes all kinds of information. We obviously have our layout, which I'll do my best to actually represent that. We've got a header, body part, and FileMaker has these little tabs or these little identifiers on the layout. But embedded within that layout are usually all kinds of things. Sometimes they're very lightweight, but we have let's say a graphic right here, and I'll try to make it like that little familiar sun that we're used to. That was a little heavy of a line right there. So these graphics themselves used to be no big deal because our network connection between a FileMaker Pro client, which is usually your desktop computer, and we've got a little computer right here with a little keyboard. That desktop computer, those are keys, by the way. That desktop computer is very fast in terms of processing information. But these mobile devices that we've now introduced into the world of FileMaker, they're not so fast, and the network connection isn't always reliable. Sometimes we're working with 3G, now we're working with 4G sometimes, which is a little bit faster, or otherwise known as LTE. But we want to make things as efficient as possible. So we need to think about a different deployment model than simply just having the database. In most cases, we want to pass back and forth as little information as possible or as necessary. So let's think about this picture. There's two places where this picture can exist. It can exist within our layout. It can also exist as part of our data. So over here we have our actual records. So all of these records, and let's say each of these records may have a little picture. So we've got some really heavy information now that we're adding into this database. And let's say this is a very high-res picture. Well, this high-res, we now need to ask ourselves a question. How many times do we need to pass this high-res image back and forth to the client? Because in this scenario, with the database being on the server, that's the only place where the information exists. It's much easier if we take some of this database and actually put it over into our mobile device. And that was an arrow fail right there. So what we're going to do is we're now going to make a new model or a new deployment model for this. We're going to make a copy of this database and put it onto the mobile device. Now, initially, this is going to cause us some problems. And the problems that we're going to find in this is this file. How do we now update this file? This file might need to get some new features or some new functionality. And the way that FileMaker works is it really doesn't care where the data is. I can perfectly easily have a layout within this actual file, which the only thing in this file are just layouts, blank layouts. Completely blank to this particular device. And what I mean by blank is I'm referring to blank in terms of the field data. In other words, the records or the information, the data does not exist in this file. All of the data can exist over in the database right here, but our layout, our presentation of that data, here's our little mountain or our little icon, everything that represents this particular database, including all of our fields and all of our images and all of our graphics, maybe some little icons. I'll try to draw a little person there representing a customer icon. Even though those icons can be extremely lightweight, we're talking like, 5K or 4K or whatever, everything that we can save in terms of time, if it's already existing over here on the client side, we don't have to have FileMaker transfer that information back over to Pro. So what happens is the only thing that gets passed back to the client in this particular example is data or text. Now, text is extremely lightweight. It's nothing like images. Binary data, such as images and sounds, take a lot of information or take a lot of space in order to pass back. So here's what I want you to think about in terms of a deployment model. If this device or if this database is on this mobile device, and some people call this the separation model, it actually is one separation model, where this particular file is our UI file, and over here this database is actually our data file. Now, some developers will deploy a model where they have both the UI file and the data file on server, but that really serves no purpose to have both of those files over here on server. You're not saving anything. The client still has to connect, it still has to pass information back, and we don't want that. What we want to do is we want to have the UI file with the layouts, with the all of the images that are used in the layouts to be stored in this file. The problem that we have, and I'm going to draw a little globe down here, and this is my very poor representation of Europe, and then over here we've got North America and Florida down there, and then Mexico, Texas, whatever have you. Let's draw some clouds and pretend that this is all in the cloud. What we want to do is we want to have a way where we can update this file. Now, this UI file can very easily connect to FileMaker server, and it can ask for the fact of, is there a newer version of this? Our data file can actually say that the requirement is we need version 1.0.3 of the UI file in order to be current. And the file over here, let's say the current one is 1.0.2. And so when it connects, it can connect to FileMaker and actually say, do I have the latest version? By checking the actual data file. And the data file can report back and say, no, I need 1.0.3, and this file says, okay, now I need to update. Now, doing that with FileMaker, it's a little bit slow because FileMaker has to go through multiple different steps when you actually communicate with server. It has to authenticate, it has to typically run its startup script, it has to do whatever else it has to do. So what I prefer to do is I prefer to have a very lightweight method of actually storing this. So let me erase what we've got right here. We'll erase that line right there and take a look at what I actually do. There is a way where you can serve up on the internet on a web server a page, and you can use just a standard .txt file. Let's say, for example, it is just your standard text file, not a .html file where we have everything that's rendered within a browser, just your regular standard text file. Now, that regular standard text file can contain anything you want within it. Now, what I do is I actually store variables. Why would I store variables? Because these variables, let's say var1 and var2, can contain whatever information you want. Let's say one of these variables actually contains a number of what is the latest version. It's 1.0.3. Now we can have in another variable a location of where that is. Where is it that I can actually find a file? And you can point to an HTTP link that actually points to a .fmp12 file. There's no big difference in terms of where you actually get the file. Now, this can be behind HTTPS, secure, or whatever, but our whole goal is within a container field, within this UI file, we simply want to transfer information. So what I do is I actually use, as I clear all of this, I actually use FileMaker's function of insert from URL. So this is a function within FileMaker that you can use that basically says this file goes out, it gets that page, insert from URL, does checking, and here's the page right here, asks for that information. If that information is updated and it contains a link, there are two different ways you can handle this. One, you can have the UI file contact server, which contacts the data file, or a completely separate file if you want. You can have another database right over here that actually serves the purpose of serving this file up. And you can transfer this file back to the UI file right there. Once it's on the device, you now need to do an update process. So let's say we've got our file, it gets transferred over, and we now have our new file, but that new file is stored within a container field. That container field right here has this file embedded into it. So what we have to do is we have to export field contents onto the device a file name that is different than the original file name. We then have to close the original file name file down and either replace it with the new file, or basically we need to get it in its place. You can't overwrite a file that's already open on the device. So there is a little bit of technical nuance with regards to how this happens, but this is more or less how it happens. The file either comes from the database itself, from FileMaker, or it actually comes from a location somewhere on the internet. And it gets transferred into that mobile or into that container using insert from URL, which you can insert a FileMaker file. No big deal, no problem. But that's how we get the update on this actual device. So now let's take this one step further. So now that we've got this file on the mobile device and this database over here that is data, remember we had all of our records right here, and some of those records have images. And those images, we have to ask ourselves, are these images something that's constantly going to be changing? If it's not going to be changing, then maybe it's better if we actually store these over on the client file. Let's go ahead and keep these stored within this UI file and only check for when those files are actually updated. Now, the way that this is typically done is over here, for each image, you have, let's say, a particular code, XYZ, that represents this image. Over here, XYZ is actually going to match that image. And I put XYX, so I'll go ahead and follow that format. But it matches now in terms of what's on both devices. So the only thing that we're passing in between the two when they communicate is that XYX, and we're asking if they're the same. Now, in the rest of the computing world, what this is known as is a checksum. And the checksum basically says, is what I have matching what you have? And this can be used within synchronization and all kinds of other technologies in order to make sure that the only thing that you're passing back and forth is not the actual data of the image itself, but you're passing this little checksum that says, does this picture match this picture? And that's exactly what we're going to do. Now, you can actually use FileMaker's length function. FileMaker's length function can be used because in most cases, when an image is updated here, the length almost never exactly matches the length of the image that you have on this device. And as soon as you compare those two lengths, that's when you actually say, okay, I need you to update and get this new image. Now, all of that can actually happen on record load, if this can be read, but you heard it as well. So you can implement a very simple system that will store not just the visual representation of the user interface, everything that's within the layout, but you can also store within the file whatever you decide to store, inclusive of heavyweight images. by storing those records and then simply synchronizing only the data that you need to. Now, getting into the full-blown explanation of synchronization is beyond the scope of this video and would take me into a much longer explanation. But essentially, if you want to use synchronization, you can use GoSync or MirrorSync from 360works, and I believe there's a couple other syncing products out there that allow you to synchronize this. But if you think about it for a while, as much as you can get over on this client side of everything, the better off you're going to be, because the only thing you're going to pass back and forth is text. That is the data that the user is actually going to interact with. A prime example of this would be, say, for example, a sales rep. And if that sales rep only deals with a certain number of products that they sell, then they're obviously going to be able to store those pictures on your local database. And so this is a deployment model that's going to save you a lot of time and back and forth in terms of using FileMaker Pro, especially on a disconnected network where the client can go down, where they may get a spotty 3G connection, or they may not have a connection at all. All right, so now let's explore this model even a little bit more in order to make things as efficient as possible. What we can do is, in most situations, a database itself is actually created and it's got all of its multiple tables. So let's say this is table A, and then we've got table B, and then we've got table C. Now, all of these tables are going to be interconnected between each other in the relationship graph. We've got B to A and A to B and B to C and all of these different connections. A lot of complexity in terms of what's going on. And FileMaker has to resolve all of that complexity when the client contacts server. Server says, what file do you want? And then passes all that information back, inclusive of everything that goes on with the graphics, which we've now attempted to offload onto the client side of things. So what our goal should be is to pass as little information as possible back and forth with FileMaker. So using our model now, we now have our UI file. And our UI file over here on the device, we've got the whole setup for all of the updates and making sure that this file checks for some either contacts FileMaker, or it contacts the internet and finds out whatever the recent file is, and all of its updates are able to handle itself. Our next goal is to look for inefficiencies in terms of the data. Now, if you ever get to the point where you can have multiple FileMaker servers, then you can obviously geographically locate a FileMaker server relative to who's using that data the most frequently. But ultimately, our goal is to do this, is to have this database, and if necessary, split this database out on the actual server. Maybe there's actually 3 different databases that we have that we're going to use all of that information. The whole point here is that FileMaker really doesn't care where the data resides. This can actually even be multiple different servers, and sometimes we don't necessarily think that we can do that, but it's certainly possible. But let's work off of the notion of one single server. This UI file, depending on how the user is actually logging in, because remember, this is the initial file that's opening up. This file does not have any of the security settings or is blank in terms of all of its settings. Maybe it just opens with just the general full access capability. So let's presume that it is opening up with the full access. Once it's opened up, once it communicates with server and an actual file, it's the file itself which has all of the permissions. But as long as this one file is able to connect to any other point on the internet, it can connect to as many other files as we actually want it to connect to. And it can also make a determination based on the access of whether or not it should connect those files. Now, what I mean by that is, since this file has no access, the access that's built into this file, which is where we have all of our security actually set up. That's our picture of our little lock right there, my poor representation. This particular file can obviously be connected to this file and connected to this file. So basically, we don't connect to those files individually. We can connect to them through this particular file, or we can connect to them directly. It really depends, because over here we have to replicate the same security into this file and the same security into this file. And the way that FileMaker works is if we open up this main file first, and then it goes through and connects to these files, it simply passes all of the login information to these files, and as long as it is the same, as long as this file is equal to this file in terms of the access, we've got no problems. But the advantage here is that the only thing that's going to be passed back and forth is whatever the information is actually coming from. And I know this is a really abstract notion to wrap your head around, but you do find certain points where it makes sense to, let's say, for example, break out our people. So say this is a common shared group of data, this people table, which multiple different clients connect to. Let's say we've got our mobile client, and we also have a FileMaker desktop client, and they both need access to people. But over here we've got our database, which has our invoices. And maybe not everybody needs to actually deal with invoices. Maybe only sales do. But we all need to access people. Using FileMaker's relationship graph and using FileMaker's functionality of external data sources, which I can show right there, allows us to actually have those, as I get rid of my documents, goodbye documents, we can use these external data sources in order to actually show what we want to show and how we want to show it, because any given file can use the external data source. This file right here can have an external data source that points to this particular file. The external data sources for this particular file, as I erase that one, this file right here can actually have external data sources that point to files A and C. Wherever those files exist, on completely different servers, on the same server, it really doesn't matter. So I want you to recognize that you can break out this information however you want to break out this information for the most efficient database possible. You don't have to keep all of your information in one file, just like you're used to, and not having the user interface file that we have right here. You don't have to have this setup anymore. You can break things out so that you can make your FileMaker solution as efficient as possible. So hopefully throughout the course of this video, you've been able to get a good understanding of how you can actually abstract from your normal way of FileMaker thinking, which is I create a database, I keep all of the tables within that one database, and the client just connects to it. Because there's a lot of things that are going back and forth across the internet, across the network, that make this a much slower solution, when you can in fact architect things so that it's much more efficient. And this is how most of the rest of software works. It only transfers back and forth the minimal pieces of information, and it's the client itself that handles all of the heavy lifting. So that is our goal when we're going to create a FileMaker solution to make things as efficient as possible. So there you have it. There's information about trying to make your FileMaker solution as efficient as possible, especially when it comes to transferring information across the network and as it applies to mobile. But of course it works on desktop as well. I hope all of this information has helped you learn more about using FileMaker Pro, that you can actually treat it like a software development environment. And the last thing that I'd like to leave you with are my well wishes, as I always like to wrap up all my videos. I wish you much luck with your own FileMaker database development, and until next time, happy FileMaking.
We hope you've enjoyed this video tutorial, and we'd like to say thank you for your subscription and your support. If you're not already a subscriber, head on over to www.filemakermagazine.com/subscribe for more information about the benefits of joining.